Today we're going to talk a little bit about wormeries because I have one. It needs a lot of attention and I'm going to reset it so that I can use all the worm castings that I've already got in there and start it up again so that I can continue to use it in the future. So what is a wormery? Well, a wormery is a way of looking after some worms, and then they can recycle all of your food scraps, and in return they give you worm castings, which are highly beneficial for our potting mixes because they are so full of nutrients. And also we can use the liquid feed that comes from a wormery as well as a liquid feed for our plants. Now my wormery is at least, I don't know, 6-7 years old, and I just keep adding to it, and I mostly use the liquid feed from it. I haven't actually yet harvested the worm castings at all from this, and I really should have. So my mission today is to essentially, well, it's going to be a bit of a longer process, but I'm going to take out the worms and then take out the worm castings and then reset it so that they've got fresh bedding, fresh food, and start it back up again. Because I want to be able to use these worm castings in my potting mix because they're going to just add so much nutrition and benefit to that mix and to the soil, and I'll have really healthy plants as a result of it. So a little bit about my wormery. Now, wormeries come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you can spend anywhere from £10 to probably £100 on a wormery, and you can make them yourself as well. But this one was from a lovely lady called Anna who runs a company called The Urban Worm. Funny enough, she did actually live next door to me for a while, but this is one of her buckets that she makes out of recycled food grade buckets. And yeah, essentially you build up all of your kitchen waste and your bedding in here for the worms. This is where you drain off the excess liquid that you can dilute for your plants, 1 part feed to 9 parts water. It has some air holes at the top to allow the moisture to evaporate, and it has a lid that you can take off to obviously fill up. And the one thing I love about this is that it's so small and compact. It can easily fit into my kitchen, into my flat. You know, I live in a very confined space. I don't have the luxury of a large house that could have a very substantial wormery, but also it can stay indoors. And I know that a lot of people keep their wormeries outside, and if you do that, you've got to protect it from the winter cold by wrapping it up and giving it a bit more extra care. You can't put just any old worm inside a wormery. It has to be the tiger worms or red wigglers. They're the ones that you sometimes see in manure. They're the natural composters that love to eat down all organic matter, and then they poop it out as the worm castings that we can then use. So let's take a look inside my wormery. So inside, I haven't added to this for many weeks now. The worms are actually probably fairly hungry, but you can tell if I just take a little bit of these castings out, it's quite a wet mix, and this isn't ideal, and it's going to be quite tricky to separate the worms from this if I was to harvest the whole lot straight away, but we've got a bit of a trick that I'm hoping is going to help with that. But this is all pure worm casting that I really want to dry out and use in my mixes. The worms are still there, they just hide below the first sort of inch or two of the mix. There we go, there's one there, look. Oh, I'm pleased to see that there definitely are still worms alive in here, but they're definitely not thriving. This isn't the perfect environment for them. So to separate the worms out from the worm castings, what I'm going to do is make a bit of a bedding box or a bait box that'll have lots of nice cozy bedding in there for them and lots of food. So I'll hopefully encourage all the worms to go into this box, and then a few weeks later, after they've moved, I should be able to take this box out entirely, and then it will leave just the castings. So I'm going to use this grape punnet. It's got holes along the side, holes along the bottom, so they'll be able to get in and out quite easily. I've got some kitchen scraps, a bit of lettuce, And my boyfriend wanted to suggest putting a tomato in because they're super sweet and delicious. So they've got a nice fresh ripe tomato. I've also in this jar got some coffee grounds. I won't be adding too much, but just a little sprinkling, and some of this straw that came in a package that I had, because worms love shredded paper, shredded cardboard. That kind of brown material makes perfect nesting. And I've also got some coir. This is a block of coir that I need to hydrate. Makes a bit of a compost, and the worms really love that for their bedding. So now I'm just going to mix up all of these things and put it into that pot, and then we'll submerge it into the centre of the wormery. There's still a few lumps in here, but I've got plenty more than what I need for the compost bin, and I'll use that in my seed potting mix. So I'm just going to now move some of this into a smaller tub like this, so I can then mix up with the other ingredients. Put in the coir, some of this lovely shredded material. I want it to be slightly damp, we don't want it to be bone dry. So I don't mind about that excess moisture that's in there. Really try and shred that up a bit. A few handfuls of coffee grounds as well. So this is what we're going to use as their new bedding mixture. And I'm just going to have a go at first putting in some coir at the bottom. Give them something nice and soft to wiggle their way into from those holes on the bottom. Then we'll add some of this lovely shredded material. A bit like a compost bin this, we're just going to be mixing it and piling it. They'll love to sort of wiggle their way through all of that. A bit more coir. I've never done this before. As I say, this bin has been somewhat abandoned over the last 6 or 7 years. I don't know why I've never harvested it from it. I just haven't. I'm going to pack it down a little bit, not too tight. Then I'm going to put the fresh food on the top. I might just split open that tomato, give them all them juices and things to enjoy. Pack on the food, that's their bait. Encourage them to come over. They are going to love this. And then I'm just going to put a little bit more of the coir on the surface just to try and keep it damp. So as you can see there, the actual level isn't very deep at all, but this is really compacted and wet. So I'm just going to try and scoop out the centre with my hand. Excuse me, worm, sorry, I'm sorry. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to clear this half side like that. Then I'm going to put in a base level of coir, just so that when I put this pot on the top, they'll be able to have a layer to wiggle into and under. Oh look, there's a little cluster of them just there. Yeah, the population isn't great right now, but we'll have a chance to start it all from fresh now. And then in goes the lovely bait box. Lots of food, lots of cosy bedding, and lots of holes underneath, through the sides, and also from above. And then I'm just going to sort of pack those sides back again, and hopefully they'll find their way. I might just make a little bit of a ramp up to it, so to speak. But that's where all the food is, so these guys should be hungry, so I imagine this is going to work and they'll find their way. So now I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks, and hopefully all the worms will be inside here, which I'll be able to take out, harvest all of the worm castings. Then we're going to dry this off, and then start to use the castings and reset up the bin. And look, they're already on their way. That's incredible. Hey, so I'm back, and it's now been about 2 weeks since I put the little bait box inside my wormery to try and lure all of those worms in so that I can empty the bin without having to fish out all of those worms individually. And I haven't really, well, I've tried not to interfere too much, but I did realise that that tub was actually a bit too tall for my needs, so I did go in about a week in and cut it into about half the height so that the worms could get in and over the top a bit easier. And I've noticed in doing so that they did quite like to be underneath it, which isn't the best because I want them to be in it, but it's getting to the point now where I could leave it another week and I might get more worms in the tub, but I want to be using the Wormery compost whilst I'm potting up all of my plants. So today I'm just going to tip it out, see how many worms are in there, harvest all of the worm compost that I've made, and then go from there because I really want to start using it. So first of all, let's open it up and see what it looks like inside. So here's the tub where I'm hoping all of the worms are hiding. Woo! It's very slippery. As you can see, there's still lots of food in there for them. And yeah, I really don't know how many are going to be in there, but I can see there are a few still on the bottom, and we're just going to tip it all out and see who's where. I'm really hoping there's quite a few in my little bait box here. Okay, let's see how many worms are in here first. Moment of truth, did it work? Well, there's one. Oh, there's another. Oh, little guys. There's another one. Oh, it might have actually worked. It's definitely lured them in, which is good. Not as many as I would have hoped. Oh, here we go. Aha, this is where they are. Oh my gosh, look at that. They're obviously quite unhappy that I'm digging them all out from their little enclosure. But I'm so glad that it's at least got some of them. I don't know how many worms we're going to even have in the entire wormery, but they're all quite small, which I was expecting, to be honest, because I haven't been looking after this wormery for the last couple of years. But they're still here, they survived, and there's quite a few more than perhaps I was expecting. Oh, this is fantastic. So yeah, I'm just going to keep fishing them out, and then we're going to set up the wormery from scratch with lots of nice bedding and lots of food to keep them nice and happy and breeding. So I've got lots more numbers of worms. Gosh, there really is quite a few in here. I wasn't expecting it to work quite so well. And then I can start to use all of that worm compost as I'm potting up all my seedlings and my plants. Just being very careful not to miss any in here. But you really don't need a lot of worm compost to benefit your plantings. Just 1 teaspoon has so many nutrients in it that's all you really need. 1 teaspoon per plant. It's really powerful stuff. Look at that cluster, there's loads of them there, can you see? Sometimes they do this when they're actually mating, as they form lots of knots and tie themselves into each other like that. Oh, I'm so pleased. You know what, I'm just going to give them a little bit of this bedding because I don't want them to get too unhappy in there. I think that's the majority of them. I'm just going to go through carefully, make sure I don't miss anybody. Oh, there's some here too. And yeah, these are all red wigglers, they're called, or tiger worms. They're the ones that you get in manure. They're not your normal earthworm. These are the decomposers of the soil. Oh my gosh. So this has worked really, really well. And I'm going to reuse all of this in their next lot of bedding, especially since they've enjoyed it so much. Now I'm just going to put this fresh bedding aside. I'm going to use that in a moment, but next I'm going to tip out the contents of this wormery bin and see how many worms are still in here, and then take a look at the worm compost itself. Now I'm actually just going to put my worms inside this big tub so that they don't wriggle out and disappear. Okay, let's see what we've got in here. It's going to be so wet. It's all stuck to the bottom where there definitely are more worms. I thought as much. But you know, most of them are hopefully in there. There's definitely loads more in here. Okay, looks like I'm going to have to very carefully tease these guys out. Because although the bait box worked, I think I should have probably left it like 3 or 4 weeks if I wanted to get the best results from it. Obviously they're still quite happy to worm around in what is essentially their own poo. I had a thought they'd have all gone into that because it's so wet at the bottom of this wormery. But obviously they don't mind it that much, or they couldn't find their way in. But yeah, there's quite a few in here, which is great because it means my population now is actually a lot healthier than I thought it was. Lots of babies too. And all of this worm compost is usable, and you know, this is very, very well rotted stuff. But worm compost is fantastic because it's one of the only types of compost, or manures should I say, that you can use fresh, whereas things like horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure, you have to let that mature and, you know, rot down for some time before you can use it on your plants. Otherwise it can burn your plants because it's just too strong. But this stuff won't. But yeah, when I feed my worms, it's usually just kitchen scraps, bits of courgette, cucumber, carrot ends, you know, things that have either gone over or they're the parts of the veg that you might not eat. And it's just such a convenient way of recycling food waste rather than putting it in to landfill. Feed it to the worms. And yeah, although I've not used the compost yet, as I said earlier, I do use the liquid feed on all my houseplants and some of my smaller crops, like my seedlings that have just started to turn into a bit more of a plant when they first need a little bit of food, because it's such a lovely natural food for them, and it's just not as strong as things like, you know, your seaweed feeds. Okay, well, I'm pretty happy that I've got all of the worms out of this now, and they're all in this little tray. So I'm going to set up the wormery again once more, and then we're going to deal with the worm compost afterwards. So this compost bin has been made with recycled materials, and I think this was actually a for sale sign that the creator would reuse. And this is the base of the kit that does have holes in it to allow the liquid to drain through to the bottom sort of sump area. But I just want to check that the holes are still clear and see what it's like down there, because I don't even know. Yeah, so it's a little bit gungy. We're going to clean that out and just reset it up. That's obviously what she's used to make sure that it doesn't collapse on itself. All of this sludgy stuff. That's also quite good worm compost, so I'm actually going to tip that with my worm compost. Although it's very, very wet, I'm going to have to dry it anyway before I can start to think about using it. This is, yeah, pretty disgusting stuff, but full of nutrients and great for our garden, so please don't be put off. But yeah, I empty the liquid from this probably once a fortnight for my plants, using the tap on the front. Now if I rinse this into a watering can, that's going to make excellent feed, which is what I'm going to do now. swirl around, a good clean, get it all out. And when you're actually making up the liquid solution, you want it 1 part feed to 9 part water. So a little does go a very long way. And as for these things, well, I'm going to give these a rinse underneath the tap, again capturing all of that goodness in this bucket, and then we'll have a nice clean start for the worms. So now then, as I set this up, I'm starting with a nice empty, cleanish tub. The tap is nice and clear. I'm going to get rid of that bit of moisture because the worms don't like an environment that's too wet. There we are, I've tipped that out. Now I'm using my little dibber tool because it's got a nice point on the end, and I just want to make sure that these holes are nice and clear. They're not clogged up with all of that manure, so that all of the excess moisture that drains through the compost in future will easily sink down into the catchment area below. So I'm just going to place those little triangles into the base of the wormery, pop this back in as well, and now it's time to make the worms bedding. Now for the worms bedding, I'm going to use some of what we already had in the bait box, which is essentially that mix of coir and some sort of shredded paper. They really do like coir, but if you can't get your hands on that, you could also use horse manure as well. And this is going to be what they sleep in, what they nest in, what they mate in. And you don't want it to be too dry, and you don't want it to be too wet either. So I'm just going to make a nice little mix. I think I've also got a few coffee grounds in here. And I'm just going to add what we had already, but I'm not going to add any food to the bedding mix because this is just nesting material only. The food will add to the top layer after we've added the worms. I might just put a layer of coir along the bottom first, so it's nice and soft. I'm not actually too sure how much of this I should be putting in. And then I'm going to add some of that lovely shredded paper. And this coir is nice and damp, but it's not too wet. So I filled it up probably about halfway up the side of that space, and then each week I'll put in a little bit of food scraps to feed the worms. Let that disappear before I add any more. I never fill this completely to the top with, you know, lots and lots of food waste. It's all about doing it little and often. But now it's time to add our special guests, our lovely worms. Look at that. They've made a tight ball. That is amazing. Look at them all wriggling around. They're going to be very happy in their new home, I think. So I'm just going to tuck them into a little pocket there in the middle and cover them back over, because worms like to nest in about the top 2 inches of their bedding. And I'll just add a little bit more. And then I'm going to give them some food. I've got some leftover lettuce that started to wilt a little bit. So I'm just going to shred this up as much as I can. Again, I also don't want to overfill it. But what I'll sometimes do is put it in just a little corner of the bin, so that if the worms don't like it or they don't want to be near the food, they can stay at the other side of the bin. And then once that's disappeared, I can then add food to this side and then just keep working it side by side. Or you can just throw it all in onto the top. This is just how I seem to do it. There we are, just a little bit like that. I might add a little bit more of this shredded material, just because this is quite dry paper, and sometimes you want to balance out the wet with the dry, so I could add something like kitchen roll or some cardboard. You know, worms will eat all of these things, and it will just help keep that moisture level down, because we don't want it too wet. There they go. That's pretty much it. Unfortunately, my camera wasn't rolling when it should have been, But what I've done is I've taken all the leftover coir that I had in here and I've mixed it into the worm compost like this, because this compost was super wet and I need to now dry it out until it's a lovely soft crumbly compost that I can use in my mixture. And just adding that coir has already really helped to sort of unclog those really big blobs of compost like this. And I know in the past when I've taken out a handful of the worm compost from the bin and tried to use it, I put it aside and it's set like rock hard. I mean, you couldn't break it at all. So I'm a bit worried that it'll set really, really solid, which is why I've added probably about, 4 or 5 good big handfuls of the coir to this mix, and I'm just running it through a bit like if I was making a crumble mixture. So what I'll be doing now is essentially leveling it out in this tray like so and leaving it to dry for a couple of days, maybe a week, and hopefully it makes a nice soft drier compost. At the minute it's still a little bit wet and claggy, just needs some of that moisture to evaporate. And then I'll join you in a few days and we'll see how it looks, perhaps use it in some of my potting, and we'll also check in on the worms and see how they're settling into their new home. Hey, so I'm back and it's been about a week and my worm compost has been drying in the shelter of my shed / polytunnel. They've gone between the two depending on how warm and wet it was, and it's now dried out to a really lovely crumbly consistency, which means I'm going to start using it, which I'm really excited about, because my tomatoes, some of these are desperately in need of potting up. They've wilted a little bit in the last half hour because I've taken them here outside and it's quite warm today and quite windy, so they're losing a little bit of moisture. But as you can see, they're growing quite well, a little bit leggy. They've been kept at home because it's still a bit cold at night time out on the allotment, but they're in need of potting up. And I've got a few different varieties here. These dwarf ones right on this side are called house tomato. That's an indoor variety that only grows to about that big. I've also got, what do I have? Red cherry, tumbling red, and sun baby as well. So all cherry tomatoes this year, just keeping it really, really simple. And the tumbling ones I may put in a hanging basket or a really tall container so that they trail down and they look rather ornamental as well as tasting great. So this compost is ready to use now. It does have a few little bits of like bedding material and there's a few lumps in here, and you don't have to sieve it, but I am going to give it a go just to see if it brings me out with an even better result. So I'm going to go get my garden sieve and pass it through that first. But as you can see, it's lovely and crumbly now. Just want to get rid of some of them lumps and bits of material. Not that this is an essential step. Now this sieve is quite a big one that I actually use over my wheelbarrow when I'm sieving my own homemade compost for getting out the really big chunks. So it's a bit big for what I'm doing here, but it's what I have, and it's a wire mesh that's probably about a centimetre wide. So I'm just going to tip this into it. And you can gently shake it like a sieve, but actually I'm just going to push it through because I don't want it falling out of the sides. This could also be a way of gently discovering if you've got any worms left. There we are, so that's nicely filtered out all the lumps and bumps. And now there we have our extra fine vermicompost. This is going to be absolutely perfect for seed sowing and adding to my mixes now. Brilliant stuff, full of nutrients. As for the compost mix, well, I have some perlite in here to add drainage and aeration, and I've got some peat-free multi-purpose compost. I'm just going to mix it into this container today. So you might be wondering how much worm compost can you use in your potting mix, and I think it's recommended that you use 1 part worm compost to 4 parts potting mix, but I want to make sure that each of my plants gets a little bit of worm compost. So rather than putting the quite a lot of it into this mix, I'm just going to put a very small, couple of tablespoons into each pot as I go. And I'm using this square P9 pot, so it's just a case of adding some of that potting mix. And obviously these tomatoes you can plant really quite deep because they root along the stem, so that goes in there. Now I'm just going to take this much, probably about a big tablespoon, and I'm just going to sprinkle that in there, and then top it back up again with the normal compost. Don't forget your label. And there we go. And that's going to immediately benefit the plant by giving it extra nutrients, micronutrients, lots of minerals, and also it's said to help prevent pests and also the uptake of water and the nutrients. So in turn you're going to get a healthier plant and a much bigger, better harvest. Oh yeah, look at those roots. Large pinch, and we go. It won't be long now until I do plant these in the polytunnel, but my main issue is that my polytunnel is still currently so full of seedlings that I'm not going to be able to do that until I have an epic planting out session on the allotment. So it probably won't be until the end of May that these tomatoes finally go into the tunnel, which suits me fine, apart from my flat is now still overrun with plants. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this episode all about my wormery. I'm really looking forward to looking after this in the future now that it's all refreshed, and using all of this amazing worm compost in my potting mix this year. If you're inspired to start a wormery of your own, just remember you don't have to go spending lots and lots of money. And if you want to check out the urban worm, the UK based urban worm, I think there's one in America too, she's got some great resources on her website on what you can feed your wormery, what you shouldn't feed your wormery, which I'll link down below, because Anna does some amazing work at the urban worm and I encourage you to go check it out. Thank you so much for watching. Do let me know if you've got a wormery and how it performs in your setup, and if you've got any tips and tricks that you'd like to share, then do put them in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.